The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, present the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World. In this session, changes to the world order from embedded liberalism to hyper globalism to economic nationalism. We hear from University of British Columbia's Dr. Kurt Huebner. After World War II, we saw the establishment of an international order under the hegemony of the U.S. This order started to collapse during the 1970s and was followed by a period of global liberalization and deregulation, which was furthered by the collapse of communism. The financial crisis of 2008 then brought a new turn towards economic nationalism in combination with a rise of forms of authoritarian capitalism. Where will all this lead us to?
Thank you all for attending. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Kurt Huebner. Currently the Jean Monnet Chair for European Integration and Global Political Economy at the Institute for European Studies at the University of British Columbia. I spent a pleasant day with Dr. Huebner, getting to know him personally a little bit. He was born in Germany, and he earned his PhD in economics and political science at the Free University of in Berlin, Germany, and lived in Germany for the first part of his life. These are his words here. He's a German-rooted academic working on both sides of the Atlantic and doing projects with money from, again, his words, the swamp of all bureaucratic swamps, the EU. Despite that sin, he made it into the country just fine, and he's with us this evening. His expertise is centered in the area of European integration in the context of global political economy that we live in. His focus is on the euro and the implications of adopting the euro, both as a currency and as its role in governance, if you will. Other areas of expertise that he has are with CETA and TTIP. CETA is the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada. Those negotiations were concluded in 2014, signed in 2016, and are currently in the process of being ratified by the 28 EU states, not completely implemented yet. That's an agreement that promises to eliminate 98% of the tariffs between the EU and Canada. It's not in full force, but it is selectively applied until both it's ratified and the EU Court of Justice gets a favorable ruling. You can correct any factual errors I make in this. The TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was the proposed trade agreement between the EU and the US. It would have been the largest bilateral trade agreement ever negotiated, but it got sidetracked with politics. The terms of these of the TTIP are classified, so whatever we learn about it will be from you, not from official sources. But anyway, these are the areas of expertise that Dr. Huebner offers us tonight. And the last area of his expertise is the national pathways to low carbon emission economies. He's published a recent book on the topic and has a great interest in the relationship between energy policy and use and governance. And so with that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Huebner. Whatever he's going to talk about, whatever it says there, it's, I think we know where this is going, but.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for this nice invitation. I have to say this joke about the European Union and the bureaucracy was generated, I was nudged, so to say, to do that by Carl, who was saying, you know, I need to make a kind of funny line for introducing myself, and then sitting on a machine, I made all those kind of, I wrote much more stuff you didn't cite. I'm happy about that. So this is the funny part of it. A bit embarrassing, you see already, there's a typo, libertarian. I put the PowerPoint, which I didn't copy edit on my USB stick, and when on the flight I realized there may be one or two more typos, so apologies. Embedded Liberalism, but you will see. So already this long subtitle tells you, first of all, I was asked to give a kind of introduction of the topics you may cover in much deeper ways during the next 2 days. So it's I try really to open a bit the kind of debate to give you an analytical, empirical overview of processes of the last, let us say, 40, 50 years or so that hopefully help to understand the current situation much better. So I will spend time also about the current developments. You know, to some degree, I also have to thank your president, Donald Trump, because he really is feeding social scientists to look much more careful into all those kind of developments with all this kind of particularly foreign policy and economic policies. So there are those issues I will tackle during my talk. But bear with me for a moment, because I would like to start with very basics that seem to be not very relevant for the overall topic I like to talk about. You know, in decentralized capitalist economies, there is the one key institution that makes all those transactions at the end of the day happen. Those are markets. And in 101 economics, students are getting trained to get an understanding. Markets are, as I say, where supply and demand are meeting each other, not in a physical way, but in this abstract way, you know, in supply and demand. Then we have a price, so to say. That's our general understanding. And if you think about it more carefully and from a day-to-daily life experience, we know markets are much more than only the meeting of supply and demand. Only in economics, sometimes you forget about that. Markets, actually, in order to function, they need quite a couple of prerequisites being fulfilled. You know, there's not a functioning market without a functioning legal system, for example. You know, you need contracts are the base of market transactions. They can be written contracts, they can be not written contracts, but then, you know, you need those kind of things. There are a lot of other elements that all are required in order that markets, both sides of market and both sides of the markets, sellers and buyers, have really this kind of trust that they would go forward to do what they intend to do. And then it needs very clearly also a kind of medium of exchange in its money. You know, stable money, if there is no stable money available, then market transactions will probably not happen, at least not in a kind of optimum way. So if you think about this and you think about all those kind of prerequisites, then we know immediately markets are social institutions that need very much input and a kind of infrastructure provided mainly by state actors. So markets are not only private institutions, they're very much social institutions. So all this is more or less well known. And I only mention all this because the topic here is international orders and means international markets. So if you think about it from the international perspective, globalization, world markets, all those kind of things, there are markets in place, there is supply and demand, but unlike at the level of the domestic economy, there is no global state. There is no equivalent to the nation state. Means in order to produce all those prerequisites for market transaction, it needs something like cooperation between nation states on the international level to establish rules of law, norms, trust, and it needs a kind of money that is being accepted from all actors, from both sides of market transactions. So, for example, I would never make any kind of, if I would sell something and somebody would offer me, let us say, money from Venezuela, you know, I would not accept this kind of money as a payment for a service or a good I would sell somewhere else. Because this money is not stable, it's not internationally recognized, all those kind of things. But all this needs to be done on the international level. Therefore, what I want to say is, if you think about international orders, again, we will never come into a situation that there will be a global state, global government, something like this. But we know about there is international cooperation necessary in various ways. And the forms of cooperation, they change over time if you take a very, very long-term perspective. Now, some of the literature in economic theory and in political science theories that are dealing with the international level, they make this argument that not only it needs international cooperation to produce those kind of trust, those kind of institutions, those kind of norms, practices, laws, and so on. Usually, from a historical perspective, all this stuff is being delivered by a so-called hegemon, means a nation state that has the ability, the willingness, and the power to produce all those prerequisites that international transactions can happen and are happening all the time. So it needs, as I mentioned, the capability of a nation state to produce and maintain international norms and practices in a very simple way. It needs the willingness of the important political actors of a nation state to perform a global role, not only doing politics for the domestic area, but designing policies that are relevant for the rest of the world. That's another element of an international global order. And number three, this nation state who would have the ability and the willingness to produce all those prerequisites that something, a stable international order is existing, this order must be designed in a way that is not only creating benefits for this hegemon, for the nation state that's producing all that, but it's creating mutual benefits for all. They may be not the same in terms of size, but only if there is something in for the others, they are also willing to cooperate. So that's the kind of, the general kind of picture. Now, obviously, not each nation state is equipped to provide all this kind of infrastructure I'm talking about. So in the literature, again, it's pretty clear it must be a pretty large economy. It must be economy with kind of strong growth dynamic. It must be an economy that is a technological leader, really a kind of frontier economy in this sense, that has really the kind of ability and superiority compared to others. And very often, then again, from a historical perspective, those nation states who are fulfilling this kind of role very often also have a very strong military power that is a kind of backup system, a kind of, that really creates this kind of trust for in worst case situations, put it this way. Now, from a historical perspective, as I mentioned, very long going back to the 15th century, this is the kind of what you find in literature. Those are various stages and periods of hegemonic cycles, if you would like. It starts with Portugal, 15th century, and so on, goes down. We don't have to go into any kind of details. I only want to stress in a very, very long perspective, economic historians and others try to work out that we have those kind of periods, they may last 30, 40, 50 years or so, where one nation state, one country would provide all those prerequisites and create something like a stable international order that only allows then to make those kind of cross-border transactions in all kind of forms. It needs this kind of stability, and only a few countries were able at the time to produce those kind of resources. Now, we are not so much interested in this very long time perspective, so therefore let me immediately move to the critical first international order created after World War II. But it's also very interesting that it needed 2 world wars, with a particular theater, so to say, in Europe, until eventually a new international order emerged that provided exactly those kind of prerequisites I mentioned that created then a long-term economic boom. So The name of this first regime was in the literature again very often labeled as embedded liberalism. I will tell you immediately what it's all about. Embedded liberalism is nothing else, let us say, as a set from particular kind of norms, rules, practices that are enshrined over time in institutions. So a lot of those institutions that have been created, actually, they were not existing before, after World War II, started from 1944, are still alive today. I only to mention the three most prominent ones, even though the roles, the functions have changed a bit, but they're still there. Tells us also that the power a hegemon can have, that even then in a situation where this hegemon may be no longer the #1 economy in the world, but the institutions are still there. So this would be GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This has then in the 1980s become the World Trade Organization. We have the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and we have the World Bank as a third kind of institution. All those institutions have been created after World War II. So this was a time after all this kind of terrible situations, again, particularly in Europe, but also in Asia, where politicians were sitting together, the famous conference in Bretton Woods, and really came up with plans that materialized and created those institutions, organizations that are still alive. At the same time, this order of embedded liberalism only really could work properly due to the fact that the US dollar not only was the national money of the United States of America, but at the same time became the world money. So until today, if you look in terms of statistics, what is the kind of money that is being used for all kind of economic transactions, whether it's a means of exchange between various partners, whether it's used for foreign direct investments, for all kind of financial products. The currency #1 until today, since the 1940s, is the US dollar, despite all those changes that are happening. The US dollar is the international money. There's a lot of advantages for the US, the kind of exorbitant privilege. So if you are running a money that is your national money, at the same time international money, you have advantages, and I will talk about it later on. So that's the reason why this embedded liberalism regime is seen in literature very much as produced, but also guaranteed by the United States of America. So what it means is a huge economy, US, they were opening up with the mechanism of the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, and then later the World Trade Organization, they were opening up their markets. The 1950s, 60s, and even until the early 70s, we saw an enormous reduction of tariffs on all levels. This was the period where GATT and then WTO, WTO came later, GATT was very much going for this low-hanging fruit, so it's called, reducing tariffs, because it was seen that exporting open markets can be a driver of economic growth. This means income and jobs. And the US were very much in favor of open markets and driving the others that were more skeptical, that were a bit reluctant to open up the markets much more. This was a time when the United States of America was very active in reducing tariffs, quotas, all kind of trade barriers, and in this way installing this kind of open economy. At the same time, it was a time when, again, coming from the US, given their superior technologies, a lot of kind of advantages the US economy accumulated over time, when US companies were investing in other parts of the Western world enormously, foreign direct investment. This was the kind of the way US companies made their own kind of markets by producing directly at those locations, again, in many parts of the world. But embedded liberalism also meant, as a third element, that written in the statutes of the International Monetary Fund and all those institutions, organizations, they were actually inbuilt capital controls. Means money could be moved out of a country to another country when it was connected with physical investment or buying majority shares in other countries of particular kind of companies. But capital controls included, there was no way, like today, that financial services, all kind of bonds and so on, could be moved around easily. Capital control was a significant element of this embedded liberalism. Why that? Because embedded liberalism came with so-called fixed exchange rates. The exchange rate, unlike today, was fixed to particular kind of values between all those kind of currencies, and central banks had the task to manage those exchange rate in order to keep them stable. What everybody wanted to avoid was those kind of swings of exchange rate were used about today. They were not existing in this period until the 1970s. Why that? Stability in exchange rate was seen as a way to create something like certainty, stability, clear expectations. Everybody who did international transaction could be sure that the value between those monies is being stabilized. And the IMF had nothing else than the job to guarantee on an international level that exactly those policies were put in place. Number one. Number two, at least in Western Europe, embedded liberalism, the opening up of markets was highly welcome. Think about those extremely successful countries in Scandinavia, but also Germany as another exporter of high significance, Netherlands and so on. All those countries were willing to open up the markets, but at the same time, they had to deal with very strong, let us say, trade unions, social democratic and socialist parties who were questioning the effects of all this kind of opening of all this liberalization. As a matter of fact, as a way to deal with this problem, the opening up of markets in Europe went hand in hand with the improvements and the strengthening of welfare states. Means governments across the board, not only social democratic parties, also conservative parties, were agreeing that trade opening up is not only producing winners, it also produces losers. That's what it's all about. And in order to avoid political trouble, welfare states had to deal with those kind of problems with the losers in active ways. So that's the other element. All this created a situation where on the one side you had the liberalization effects in economic terms, and you had a kind of relatively quiet political climate in most of those countries because the problems were dealt with in very active ways. And this is from a famous book that dealt with the period is called the golden age of capitalism. So in a period between the 1950s and 1973, you can see here, that's the critical one, that's the period of embedded liberalism, if you would like, where we have the opening of markets again. At the same time, we have those capital controls, we have the rise of welfare state, all those kind of things. But look at it, the annual GDP, the growth rate of the gross domestic product from all those kind of periods, by far the strongest. So this kind of embedded liberalism was exactly producing the outcome that was expected by those ones who put this whole system in place. And you also can see it's not only the GDP, it's also GDP per head. I mean, it's a kind of a way to measure productivity, highest productivity improvements over the time. So, you know, and from today's perspective, it's a bit paradoxical because very often we were taught, at least students were taught until recently maybe, that only total liberalization would reap those kind of great benefits. Embedded liberalism is a system of liberalization with brakes, if you would like, with some controls. And still, the outcome was, in all those kind of economic terms, was excellent. So, but there were internal endogenous kind of contradictions, obviously. And over time, the more successful the system was, the more catching up happened in Western Europe, but also in other parts of the world. The technological leadership of the United States was getting smaller and smaller as a kind of natural process, but the others benefited very much from the opening up of all those markets, from all those opportunities and possibilities. So that something happened that where people were always astonished if they hear the number. The first time in the 20th century, the US had a deficit in the trade balance for goods, not services, was in 1971. Since then, the US has a deficit in the trade balance. Nothing new. I mean, it's now 45 years or so, or 48 years, something like this. So it happened exactly there. Why? Not because the US out of a sudden did very badly. It's more or less because the others were catching up. They followed this kind of lead. They benefited from the opening of the whole system. They benefited from the kind of learning effects from the US and all those kind of things. But then, if this is happening and the leadership of the hegemon is getting questions, then things are getting a bit complicated. Particularly, like this happened, as you know, in the 1970s, there was something like a war in Vietnam, and very costly, like all wars are very costly. So this was driving public debt in the US. At the same time, it was also a kind of upward pressure on the side of the inflation rate of the United States of America. All this together, what it means is, if your money, but it's the national money as well as the international, global money, if the inflation rate of this money is higher than in other parts of the world, if investors are feeling more and more that the US dollar is no longer worth the amount that is guaranteed by this fixed exchange rate system, people want to get rid of the US dollar. It's a bit difficult in the system, but exactly this was starting to happen. So that from the monetary side, this embedded liberalism regime also came under enormous pressure. And again, in 1971, the year when the first trade deficit was observed for the United States of America, President Nixon at the time declared in a unilateral way, and that's again a lesson of history, it's nothing that President Trump is doing only unilaterally. President Nixon at the time was unilaterally saying, guys, the rest of the Western world, we don't longer are investing in this fixed exchange rate system that's passed from now on. We don't intervene. Exchange rates are from now on determined by market actions and no longer by any kind of interventions of the central bank. So the monetary pillar, so to say, of embedded liberalism went away. As I mentioned, we saw this kind of catch-up dynamic in many parts of the world. The country that actually, due to a particular kind of export strategy, was the most successful during the 1970s was Japan. Japan in the 1970s was the China of the 1970s, put it this way. So this was, in all regards, was seen as the enemy because they were so successful, again, in terms of catch-up and of productivity and of particular kind of products they were producing, and they were investing a lot of their surpluses also in the United States of America. So one response already in the late 1970s, 1980s to the rise of Japan, and you can see how history is repeating itself. The Reagan government at the time, they introduced very, very strong anti-Japan tariffs. You can see them here for a range of industries, textiles, automobiles, all these kind of things, quotas, tariffs, all this kind of stuff has been introduced already under Reagan. We forget about those kind of things, but they happened there, and still the international economy was still alive. So those are episodes that are happening, but with the same kind of sentiment, defending the economic interests of the US against one of the main competitors at the time. This was seen as Japan. But, let's go back. There is this other element. if I look around, at least a kind of majority of the same age range like myself. So you may recall 1973, but only 1971, the end of Bretton Woods. 1973, the so-called oil crisis. It was never an oil crisis in the sense, it was a dollar crisis. Why that? The OPEC producers of oil, they sold all this kind of stuff to US, to the rest of the world. Which money were they paid with? The US dollar. But when 1971, the fixed exchange rate system ended, the main result was a huge depreciation of the US dollar. You know, for example, I recall in the German case, it was like $3, 1 US dollar to 360 Deutschmark. After 1973, it was 1 US dollar to 1 Deutschmark 60, something like that. An enormous depreciation of a shock. The exchange markets across the world had to be shut down due to this kind of situation and so on. But it was a huge problem for the oil producers because they were paid in US dollars. Means for each barrel of oil they were selling, they got a money that was losing value from day to day. So they were really losing out. One way to deal with this is forming a cartel. That's exactly what they did. This was the so-called oil crisis. All of a sudden, they said, okay, we are rationalizing those kind of things. We don't sell the same kind of amount of oil any longer in the hope that this would drive up the prices, what exactly also happened, and create another kind of instability. So this whole system of Bretton Woods was coming more and more under pressure. And at a time, 1980s, you know, the situation was pretty much like this. I recall there were all those kind of books, academia, all was full of books, publications, the end of US hegemony. That's it. So there's a kind of vacuum. We need to redefine the world order. There's something new must come into place and all this kind of thing. So what actually happened is that Reagan and then followed by Margaret Thatcher in the UK, those two countries, more or less, were leading the pace by saying, okay, we need to find answers to those kind of contradictions and the problems that could be observed. And the answer was a very, very strict policy of deregulation and liberalization of the national economies. And what happened is that particularly the finance industry was enormously liberalized, and they were opening up of all kinds of possibilities how they could act. And what this meant is, in the nowadays terms, it's called financialization, means the financial sector became more and more dominant. But what are financial institutions, banks, all kinds of institutions, what they are doing is, they have a different way to look at economic returns and economic processes. Companies, you would expect they have a kind of long-term perspective. When they're investing, you know they need to put everything needs to put in place, and then the return may come only, the real return may only come a couple of years later. The banking system has a different kind of time perspective, very short-term, you know, quarterly reports, all those kind of things. So this has changed the way investment decisions were being made, number one. Number two, it has also implications, as we all know nowadays, to the way those CEOs, the leaders of those companies, were enumerated, because they were enumerated on the basis of those short-term perspectives. And we see a huge kind of the CEO culture out of that. You do all those kind of names. You have companies where connected with images, the leaders of the world, all those kind of things. And and I give you two graphs to showcase this. Now, from a global economic perspective, those brownish pillars, they show the level of financial integration, and the greenish are showing trade integration. And you can see for quite a long time, trade integration, the fact that exports, imports were the drivers of the economy, was pretty strong. When those effects of liberalization and deregulation came really into being during the 1980s, things changed. And financial integration has become the driver of the global economy. And you can see here much, much more important than trade. dealing across borders with all kinds of financial products has become the key element. And number two, this resulted, or not in a causal way, went hand in hand, put it this way, with an enormous rise in inequality. If you deregulate and liberalize all those kind of sectors and all those activities, one way markets are dealing with this is winner takes all structures. And you can see here the vast majority of countries between 1985 and 2008, before the financial crisis hit, they all experienced pretty strong increases in income inequality. Remember, those arrows are up, go up in very strong ways. So that's another kind of backlash, if you would like, of this period of what I call, others are calling too, hyper globalization. The fact that financial factors are driving all those kind of things. So, again, like in the 1970s, what we can observe in the 1980s, Japan is no longer relevant for the global economy at all. Why not? They are in this situation of a secular stagnation due to a burst of the financial bubble during the 1980s in Japan. They created a very difficult situation, over debtedness of all those kind of sectors. And the result is that those sectors need to deleverage. They don't grow any longer. They need to degrow, so to say, in order to survive. And Japan is out of the picture. But during the 1980s, we see the rise of another global actor due to their own opening policies that have been different from the opening policies of the system of hyper globalization, and that's China. And you can see here, not only from the end of 1990 until today, the rise of China in terms of the share of their exports in the overall world market is going up in a kind of very clear way. Japan, since the late 1990s, going down in a steady way. Russia, if there would be no resources, they would not be even in the graph because they are not in any other way relevant in economic terms. The US, also a trend line, a negative one, the same for the European Union. So we see in a different way also a new competitor coming up to a decline in economic terms, a relative decline of the United States of America, of the EU and Japan, and this kind of void is being filled by China. Now, unlike Japan, in the 1970s, 80s, China is obviously a different kind of economic entity. It's a combination of authoritarian political regime, state capitalism, and private capitalism. Those three elements are coming together. But obviously, in terms of performance, pretty successful. Now, this all happened during the 1980s, 1990s. Only in the late 1990s, there was more attention given to China. Until then, it was a kind of minor topic in the use and all this kind of analysis and so on. The main topics actually still had to do with the backlashes that came from this period of hyper globalization. The first kind of alert, if you would like, alarm, was, as I mentioned, the move of Japan into this so-called balance sheet crisis, means a long-term stagnation. That's what started to happen. But this was seen as a kind of special case for Japan, not relevant for the rest of the global economy. Then we saw next kind of alert, critical, the U economy bubble from 2001. But then again, the U economy bubble was overshadowed by 9/11, the same year. So, there was this economic effect, but it was never really, people were more looking at the security aspects and terrorism of 9/11 than really studying in careful ways the U economy bubble of 2001. The really big thing happened obviously in 2007, the global financial crisis, and all this, even though it's, there are still controversies about the kind of sources of the
global financial crisis and so on. But it's pretty clear. It has very much to do with the fact that the system of financialization, of a dominance of the financial sector, of very complex products that are creating a lot of interdependencies and so on, all this created this kind of situation of 2007. In 2010, to some degree, totally independent from the global financial crisis of 2007, we saw the start of the Eurozone crisis, particularly given with the case of Greece. This is preoccupying Europe and the Eurozone since then, even though at the moment it looks very calm and relatively stable, but for many, many years, a big issue. And all those crises during the 2000s, 2001 until 2010, put it this way, and then continuing, all this created kind of youth sentiments. It created a lot of discontent, trouble, question marks about the way this new economic order, hyper globalization, that was seen as the way out of the crisis of embedded liberalism, out of a sudden, this whole system that globalization could solve the world problems and everybody, oh, you need only to open up all those kind of markets, you need to liberalize and things are getting good, turned out to be questionable, put it this way. Particularly given the fact that with liberalization and deregulation, this also means a disembedding of markets, rather than that those prerequisites are provided by the state. The idea was markets by themselves can produce all those goodies. But it turned out with all those crises, they're running their own kind of problems. They don't produce only goodies, they also produce a lot of baddies, put it this way. And so that's the situation. And now, the situation since, I would say, 2010 or so, is very much that we are confronted on all levels with a discontent of citizens, of voters. They feel the stress coming from those crises. But not only if they feel them, sometimes they experience them, and in very strong degrees, they anticipate, even though they may not be victims today, but they anticipate they can become victims tomorrow. And this is driving, so to say, these new forms of, or in the plural, forms of economic nationalism. First of all, only slowly people are realizing, and academics are, economists are very bad in this respect anyway, they still sell the idea. My Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, for example, doesn't hesitate to go to the mic and tells all the time, all those trade agreements are fantastic if only winner, winner, winner. That's actually not even economics 101. A student just starting first term would learn that this whole thing about comparative advantage is the economy as such is winning, positive. Everybody. So open trade is fantastic, free trade, but internally there must be losers and winners. The wins are higher, the gains are higher than the losses, but those ones who are losing out, they don't care about the winners as long because they are now getting excluded from the market. Very simple. If you open up markets and out of a sudden you can, and if I look around, I guess so 80% of the cloth you have is not produced in the US, somewhere else. Makes good sense. Why should we, with all the capabilities we have, produce all those kind of cloths, for example? You can buy it from Vietnam or wherever, the business of the day. Makes total sense. So you open up, they're getting the stuff cheaper, that's good for us, for consumers. Those ones who are producing cloth, suits and so on, they are losing out. Even though as a society we are winning. So if you don't take care of those losers, this can create problems. Particularly if this is happening on a larger scale. And that's exactly one of the political kind of repercussions of the costs of hyper globalization, that people feel more and more part of belonging to the loser group. Number one. Number two, as I mentioned, I think that's very important. Even if you don't lose, You may get a new job, but a new job may not pay the same kind of wage than the one you lost before. So even then, you are losing out in absolute and also relative terms. And number 3 is, particularly given for middle classes, that they feel about they may be the next victims. You know, it's not there yet, but they may. All this is the more astonishing, given the fantastic empirical, well-documented insights that trade actually is only creating about or explaining about 20% of unemployment. 80% of unemployment across all countries, including the US, is explained by technical change. But people have different kind of perceptions. They feel that all the kind of bad things are coming from the global level. There is a lot in it, but it doesn't explain really the kind of problems we are dealing with. And that's being used, again, I would argue, by those ones in a huge number of countries that are trying to mobilize national sentiments, saying, you know, we came into all those kind of problems due to the fact that we opened up too much. There is this country and this, they take away the jobs, they take away the income and all those kind of things. So we see this in many, many countries. America first, obviously, you know this better than me, but we have Agité Français. There's a long-lasting, particularly after 2008, the financial crisis, across a lot of parties were saying, okay, rather than buying stuff from all parts of the world, we need to buy more French products because this is creating more jobs in France and so on. So it's a soft version of protectionism, if you would like. Brexit, it has a lot of reasons why the Brexit referendum happened the way it happened, but it's also driven very strong by the impression that Europe, the European integration project, would create more costs for the UK than benefits. You know, again, same kind of thing. You can say Brexit, to some degree at least, is driven by this idea. If we separate from the international, then we save the day. So economic nationalism, in many respects, is, from a macroeconomic perspective, nothing else than beggar thy neighbor policy. You know, the terms are easily being used. President Trump is always saying, I'm totally in favor of free trade. It only must be fair trade. But fair trade, in his kind of definition, is nothing else that the US should import more than export, export more than import. The same across the board. Everybody is making this argument. But as you know, from a logical point of view, there can be a situation where each country has a trade surplus. Where surpluses must be a deficit from a logical point of view. So some countries, you know, must have the ability to bear deficits. And there may be good reasons for all that. So, but still, economic nationalism is nothing else than trying to use all kinds of tools to increase benefits and to shift the cost to others. And that's the kind of the background for what we in the newspapers, what's being called trade wars. You know, the trade war actually is already there. And I can say, in many respects, let us say, Germany, with its extremely large surpluses, is also part of this whole trade war, but in a different way than it's being used as a term by many of those political parties. Now, briefly to the US, in the last 1.5 years, 18 months or so, since the new presidency is there, what we can see besides all kind of rhetoric, is more or less a retreat of the United States of America from the global level. It started out from the very beginning with, you know, and again, one can discuss a lot about the advantages or disadvantages of the Trans-Pacific trade partnership that has been cancelled. Then the retreat from the Paris Climate Agreement. We see the questioning of NAFTA, even though things are getting a bit softer now. We see, a couple of months back, first of all, introducing those kind of tariffs on solar cells and washing machines. Then it has been extended now to steel, aluminum. Today, he announced that, forget about all this kind of stuff. We exempt not only Canada and Mexico, we exempt the whole European Union and also Japan. And therefore, instead we introduce now 25% tariffs on a volume of $60 billion for 1,300 products coming from China. So there will be responses from China coming. So, you know, there are all those, then Mr. Trump is saying, as he sees only in Washington and New York, all those kind of German cars. So we need to do something with the German cars. And again, he's right, you know, in Vancouver, for example, the probability in the neighborhood I'm living to get run over from my bike with a German luxury car is like 90%. Compared to Berlin, it's like 10% because nobody can afford those huge cars. And they're so expensive, but here you can, symbolic capital. So there are all those kind of issues coming up. So this means United States of America, I don't want to say they totally retreat, but they are no longer the willingness, as I mentioned at the very beginning, to provide those kind of disorder, the stability for the global level is no longer there. And it's obviously shared across both parties. Maybe not a majority, but it's definitely the kind of strategy of the Trump government. And we see at the same time that he's also not only attacking all those kind of other partners, allies in many respects, he's also now really working very hard to undermine the World Trade Organization. He's since 8 months now, he's not sending they have this kind of appeal panel if there are conflicts. So the US is not willing to send a EU judge there, but you need 3 judges to make cases. Currently there are 3. In 8 months from now, there's only 1 judge left over because the tenure of the others is running out. Then this whole appeal body will be gone. This is the pillar of the WTO. You know, it's not a way you send nobody there, and institutions who are based on this kind of cooperation, mutual cooperation, are no longer able to function. Very simple, those kind of things. So that's the really disturbing part, that in a situation where the global economy would need stability, would need those kind of inputs, the most important country seems to be no longer willing to play the game according to the rules that are in place. You all know this, the country that was immediately using this opportunity, at least in terms of announcements, is China. The Chinese president, now lifelong, at the World Economic Forum in Davos a year ago, made this kind of statement that, you know, if you read it, I read it, and you close your eyes and you don't see the person, combined with it, you think this is the greatest free trader in the world. He made really the kind of case, you know, that China would now save the global economy and being willing to do all this kind of liberalization and fair trade and all this kind of things. So they see their opportunity. At the same time, the question is, and obviously the concern from many is, you know, should a regime that comes with a very authoritarian political regime combined with those kind of capitalism, state as well as this unfettered private capitalism, is this the right kind of candidate, the right kind of actor to provide and lead the world economy in the 21st century? There are a lot of question marks behind it, something we can discuss. I at least would have a lot of question marks. So, you know, if China tries to move into the spot, but with a kind of different strategy, with different intentions, and we look around who else is there, then, then we can look at the European Union. The EU, from a purely economic international perspective, is extremely active. Those are all those kind of agreements, trade agreements, is the most active trade policy actor in the global economy currently. And they try to be there to make their case, to really make use of the negotiation power of the largest market in the world. They have all those kind of agreements, so that seems to be good. They are running, it has been mentioned, there will be probably never a kind of agreement with the United States of America. I would be very skeptical. Not only with this president, also with other presidents for a variety of reasons. But they still try hard to establish themselves on a global level when it comes to trade policy. The problem, though, is that you only can be a strong international actor if you have your domestic affairs, you know, in good shape. And the European Union and the Eurozone, I would argue, are not very well positioned to really play a very important role. There is, you have enormous problems with the Eurozone. I mean, we all know the next crisis is coming. All the time, there's always a crisis coming. And if you take this kind of worst case perspective and you ask yourself, how well prepared is the Eurozone as an institution to deal with the next large crisis, then the answer is not very well. Because they don't use the time that is now there, the good times, the relative good times, to make all those reforms that are necessary to make an incomplete currency union to a complete currency union. The main problem of the Eurozone is it's incomplete. But there are too many diverging interests in the Eurozone. They will not make this kind of reforms in the next couple of years, if at all. Number one. Number two, you see also, besides the economic factor, you see another element of contradictions in the European Union that undermine a potential strong role on the international level. This is very much the discussion, strife about the value base of the project of European integration between the Western core countries and Eastern Europe. I mean, it has become a huge problem. It's getting underplayed by the Commission, also by national governments for various reasons. But there's no doubt about it that the majority of the EU member states of Eastern Europe are actually moving into a direction that is no longer covered by the common political democratic values of the Western core. It's not only Poland, it's Hungary, but it's across, you have all those kind of countries, are Romania, even Bulgaria, a lot of, corruption, political clientelism, all those kind of things that lead to situations that the EU is more and more dedicating its resources, moral resources, political resources, to some degree economic resources, to deal with their internal contradictions. So again, if you go back to this kind of prerequisites for a hegemon, it's pretty clear the EU has its acts not really in order. So they are, as long as they are preoccupied with their internal contradictions, they are a weak international actor. Not to talk about the military stuff and all this other things. So that's the other element. So the result of all this could be, one could make the argument, and I'm going back, we are currently experiencing a classical situation of, first of all, a hegemonic vacuum. There is no really hegemon there providing all this kind of infrastructure that's necessary. And we see number two, hand in hand, a fracturing of the economic, political power of the global economy. We see three actors, critical ones, not to talk about there were many others. I didn't touch upon Russia from a different perspective. We saw for a time the so-called BRIC countries, but there are also kind of a lot of contradiction. We see actually not a single country that would be either willing or able to provide all those kind of elements that are necessary to create stability. In other words, one implication is not only today, but for the next future, I would argue, we are confronted with an enormous fragile global order, with a lot of instability, with a lot of conflicts between various actors where the current policies being taken by the United States of America are adding to this fragility, but are not only causing it, because there are other deeper reasons for all that I try to lay out. So that's the kind of situation. And the question then is, there are still those institutions. I mentioned IMF, I mentioned World Bank, WTO. There may be others, the bank of the central banks and all those kind of things. Are those institutions that are still there, are they providing the kind of resilience that is necessary to deal with the fragility? Optimists are saying exactly, a lot of international relation specialists make this argument saying, those institutions, they may not be the best, but they're still there and they make us survive all those kind of political developments on the national levels. But then again, those institutions to some degree are also dependent from the support of nation states. So how long this will work is another question. So what I would end with is a kind of more, not really very dark perspective, but at least making pretty clear from the way I'm reading, based on this kind of historical overview, the current situation, we are in this situation of high fragility, a lot of power struggles, a lot of very domestic-driven policies that are not providing the international inputs that are necessary to create stability. So in this regard, we need to deal with all kinds of risks, and as far as possible also with uncertainties in the next couple of years. And that is not a good situation if we take into account that, like always, history shows us a next crisis will come. And if the next crisis is coming in this kind of void, in this kind of leaderless global economy, then we are not well prepared to deal with it. And this may, on the one side, either to lead to more economic nationalism, but economic nationalism also means then a kind of a different way to de-globalize, not in a planned way, but in a kind of domestic, interest-driven way. And that's also adding more fuel to the problems, probably, than really solving the situation. Okay, thanks so much.
Who has a question? We ask that you use a microphone, please.
Well, thank you for that great overview. Is this on? It seems to me, and I wondered if you agreed with this, that it's really by choice that the U.S. is pulling back from this role of hegemon. And the way I perceive it is that 9/11 happened, and then we got very focused on the wars, and of course that's very draining, and so that caused us to think, well, maybe we better refocus internally in various ways. Barack Obama wanted to do that. And now, by poor policy choices, as well as this choice to sort of withdraw, we're just giving up this role. I'm wondering if that's how you see that.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. I mean, if we would go through those regimes of hegemony, where I start with Portugal and so on and so on, there's not a single case where a hegemon would deliberately say, you know, that's it. We are no longer dealing with the international level in the same way than before. We are returning and retreating to our domestic part. All of them tried very hard to keep up their leading position. The US seems to be, they would, you know, from all this kind of criteria, I would argue the US would still fulfill, they would have the capability to provide the rest of the world in cooperative ways, working with others, particularly with those natural allies, so to say, including the European Union, to do the best. One thing only about climate policy, there's no doubt about it. If the US would have followed the Obama path and with the climate policy, you know, there would be other expectations about the success of those instruments put in place than we're dealing with now. There's no doubt about it. So I would totally agree. It's the first case, I would argue, where a country that has the capabilities and the power to work with others to the better, to deal with a lot of those problems of hyper globalization, would say, no, rather than cooperating with the others, we actually try to focus on our national interests, economic nationalism, and rather than cooperating, we go our own way. We retreat, we say no, 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 all those kind of things. So that's the very unfortunate situation. But you know, and the way, what makes me a bit more optimistic is more or less think about now, let us say, the most recent suggestion to introduce those 25 and 10% tariffs on steel and aluminum. You know, it came out very big. It turns out now, Trump is now making the suggestion, everybody's exempted. It's only about China. Now, again, he has a good case. There's no doubt about it from my perspective. China is misusing the global economy since many, many years, particularly when it comes to intellectual property rights, when it comes to technology transfer. It's a well-known problem. The US, for many years, was not willing to be part of any kind of coalition that would address this kind of problem. The European Union, they would be, in the meantime, very happy if there would be others to work along jointly and to bring China on a kind of a level like many others, that they would play according to rules. Now, with singling out, or to put it this way, with first of all addressing, making this kind of huge wave about tariffs, all those kind of things, at the end of the day, making clear it's all about China, but doing it alone with tariffs, that's not a cooperative way to deal with it. It will not be successful, by the way. It will create a lot of problems. So again, this would have been a wonderful opportunity to ally, to work up with others, to come to a joint position against a country that is in some respects violating the rules of the game. But the way it's being done, it's only creating those kind of, let us say, negative sentiments in all parts. It's undermining trust. You know, all of a sudden, if you see from a European perspective, if you see the US no longer as an ally, but as somebody, an actor that is actually questioning your own kind of economic policies, then it's getting difficult. So I agree. It's a deliberate political strategy that obviously has support, at least on the side of voters. That's the way I see it. It may change, but I don't know. I would not, in this regard, I would not be optimistic. I don't know. He has a mic. I can't.
The question I had was, it seems like this version of nationalism that the current administration is doing is much more militaristic, closing of the borders, the fear issues, protection, which to me sort of leaves China in the driver's seat economically, because I don't think this administration is looking that closely at some of the economic issues. They're looking much more militaristic. But if we escalate against Korea, does that change China's sort of economic position? And how does that play out as this administration tries to close more of our borders while still keeping our military all around the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there a way that the projector can be started again? Hello, is there somebody still in here? Because I have a nice picture that would. Yeah, I'm. No. Anyway, okay. The graph I didn't show you before. I wanted to show you now, but I can talk about it. It's a graph that shows for the last 15 years with which kind of countries China enormously intensified its trade relations. And the graph would show you that China, in the meantime, has become a very, very strong regional power in Asia, to the detriment of Japan, as we know, and South Korea also has its own kind of problems with it. So, but they already are in a very, very strong economic situation in the region. They come forward with the Silk Road project. You may have heard about it, One Belt, One Road thing, a project. And they created also, you know, where the US was first against it, then somehow not really in favor, but not really more kind of neutral, when they created this Asian infrastructure bank as a kind of counterpart to the World Bank. So they create their own institutions, you know, that's already happening. And the Silk Road project is intends to invest $900 billion over a period of 25 years. More or less infrastructure in order to make all those kind of trade channels working across Eurasia and then to Europe. So that's, you know, that's a hegemonic project, if you would like, because if this would be put in place, it's not the dominance of the world, but it would again show that China is very actively planning those kind of things with long-term projections, setting up institutions and providing financial resources to make this happen. We don't have from the Western part any kind of counter project there. You know, climate policy would have been one way to deal with this, another kind of project. It needs a lot of money, a lot of investment in a different way. But again, there's no way to go for it from a United States perspective. So you can see China is doing those kind of things. It runs into problems. Number one, political problems. You mentioned South Korea, Japan. They all don't feel very well about it. We see the kind of if we have an economic nationalism in the US and in parts of Europe, including Germany, which is Alternative for Germany party and so on, and in many parts of Europe the same kind of thing, then we have political nationalism in China. The speech of Xi, when he was now announced for lifelong running the show, I didn't do it myself, I can't read Mandarin or Chinese, but I read about it. The term nation has been mentioned in the speech 85 times. And China is very much, in terms of ideology, becoming a very kind of strong national power. They really try to defend, to justify what they're doing with all those kind of terms. It's a bit, you know, for me reading it, it makes me shudder, but that's the kind of sentiment. They present it in different ways to the rest of the world, but that's another element. So we see this kind of nationalist kind of interest expressed in various ways. And I think so that's also disturbing in many, many respects. Yeah, he's...
Thank you. Sort of a two-part question related. The first part is in the hyper globalization slide. You mentioned the economic crisis of 2007 as a consequence, but that wasn't that more of a financial? Most of these arguments are about trade, but I didn't see the financial crisis as really a trade crisis in the same sense that some of these other ones were. It created a lot of counterparty risk, perhaps across borders, but. I guess if you could explain the relationship between the hyper globalization and this specific thing. And then the second part of it, which is somewhat related, is that you also had a chart that showed the shift in dominance between trade in goods and financial. The brown bar went way up recently. Are the Basel Accords sort of the financial equivalent of global trade agreements that try and even the playing field when you have transactions that aren't physically related, but they're simply financial instruments across borders? Is that a cause for optimism that international agreements are trying to be reached about the stability of global banking as opposed to global trade?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, you know, when you it was my fault, put it this way, giving this or running through this kind of long history with all those kind of things, I may have not been too precise when it comes to hyperglobalization. The argument was, and therefore those bars, first of all, hyperglobalization is a term meaning, okay, thanks, okay. Women. Fantastic, that's exactly what happens back home. My wife is doing all those kind of things. I'm only talking, she's doing the real stuff, so thank you. I would never be able to do that. So coming back, so hyperglobalization was a kind of label, meaning we see due to those processes of policies of deregulation and liberalization, they were all mainly addressing the financial sector. The financial sector until the late 1970s was highly restricted. You may have heard about banking is the most boring job. You know, at the time when I grew up in a little village in the southern part of Germany, my parents, rather than the only guy who went ever to university, so but they made the hard case in Kurt. You could go to the Sparkasse, that's a kind of those little local banks, so to say, and you can learn there and getting trained, and then maybe in 15 years you are the director of the Sparkasse. This was absolutely, for me, the most terrible kind of idea, because it was so boring, you know, moving around those figures and then taking the savings of those people and so on. Absolutely terrible. But this was the image of a banker, and the Germans were extremely successful. Think about Deutsche Bank. You know, this was the kind of the bank, at least in the German European case, for solidity, all those kind of things. Things changed in the 1980s. I recall the head of the Deutsche Bank, by some chances, I met him twice in a kind of more smaller setting. This was long before any crisis. I was sitting there as a macroeconomist and thinking, okay, what is he doing? Liberalization, all kind of making the world with money, so to say, and sending around, creating all those products, all those kind of things. This is hyper globalization. The bars were showing this. We saw an enormous increase, no longer capital controls. Banks could act everywhere. The new products were being created, all those kind of things. The problem was that those products were very interdependent. They were very often very complex. For example, in the case of financial crisis US, even though the trigger was the mortgage problems, but as it turned out, the mortgage was not really, was a trigger, not a cause. It turned out there were many of those kind of other products, the way banks were acting, all those kind of things, were much more critical. This led to all those kind of changes in policies and so on and so on. So what I want to say is, those backlashes I mentioned, 2001, new economy bubble, already the real estate bubble of Japan, even if real estate, it's more or less that banks were in an unregulated way handing out monies and investing, not only in Japan, across, they bought in the whole half of Hollywood and all those kind of Sony, all those kind of companies, a lot of those things, and it turned out the profits are not covering the costs of those debt and all those kind of things. So we saw 2001 new economic crisis, nothing to do with trade, all financial problems, over speculation, over confidence in those kind of companies, over leveraging, and then that happened. Same as 2007. So hyper globalization actually was then coming down in terms of various ways of financial crisis. And if you would, I don't have a slide for that, it's well documented, since the end of Bretton Woods, since this exchange rate system and the capital controls were given up, the number of financial and banking crises increased enormously. Before that, there were only a few banking crises. It was the domestic thing. We had a saving banks problem in the US and all those kind of things, but not on an international level. This has changed enormously. And this is, so to say, nothing else than the financial system has come out of control of the nation state. And then Basel comes in and a couple of others. So there were efforts put in place, called Basel I, Basel II, the kind of what kind of capital do banks need to keep in order to deal with risks in a brief way. So that's one way to deal with it, but it turns out most of those banks for quite a long time, and some until today, not so much in North America, because this was one of the success stories of the Obama government, the risk level of US institutions has come down enormously, not so much in other countries. Italy is the most prominent case of highly over-leveraged banks, but across many countries, the number of non-performing loans, how it's called in the literature and in all those kind of banking reports, is enormously high. The highest banking risk currently, would you know what they are? The highest share of non-performing loans and over-indebtedness of all sectors. Would you know the country? China. China is it's only due to the fact that it's a state-run country. They can deal with it at the moment, but that's the next risk factor. China can easily come into the same situation like the global economy in 2007. And that's at least according to IMF, World Bank, OECD, WITS, the Bank of International Settlement, and all those experts are indicating the same kind of direction, highly over-indebted. But that's the way the economy is growing there. It's not only due to proper kind of management, it's also due to this enormous credits, and they are ending up particularly in those state-run companies. And that's the reason why this is unfair trade, because the state-run companies should be long time bankrupt, going out of the market, but they're still getting easy access to those credits, and so on and so on, so it's an own story. So means, even though there are international efforts like Basel, a couple of others, we see already the retreat. I mean, one of the things what Trump is doing is reducing the kind of, let us say, risk management factors that have been put in place with various laws. They are getting reduced a bit and getting more differently managed. So Wall Street is absolutely happy with the guy because, again, it's a kind of liberalization that is happening, and means on the other side, the risk level is increasing. So it's a long way to make this kind of international cooperation to come up with the same kind of rules and practices, and that's, man, it's would be an own evening. That's the reason why I was saying the Eurozone is an incomplete currency union, because exactly this kind of banking union, the critical part, are missing. And this would create a totally different kind of situation in Europe if there would be something like this. But the creditor countries, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and so on, who would have to cover some of those non-performing loans, worst case situation, they're not willing to do this. Means, I'm a total critical kind of person when it comes to Germany in this respect. Germany is totally undermined. They're playing the kind of Trump game since a long time when it comes to the Eurozone. So they're only doing following policies in the favor of Germany. So Germany is doing fantastic. It's great. But they're not willing to really, even though everybody's saying they pay for Greece and so on, nobody pays for Greece. Would you know the amount of money the German finance minister earned over the last, since 2010, due to the fact that for a long time, German bonds, government bonds, and everybody has government bonds all the time, over a 2-year period, when the government bonds, the interest rate was negative. People were willing to buy 10-year German bonds, even though their interest rate was negative. They sold it. Why? It's not a simple thing. Why are they doing it? Are they crazy? They are not. It's exactly reflecting what I'm saying here. Uncertainty, fragility. People are willing to take small losses, but still have a bond in their hands that they're very aware of, that this government will not go bankrupt. So they are willing to take losses in order to get a higher degree of certainty. So that's a kind of trade-off we are producing. But again, even in the European Union, that's what I want to say is, it's very difficult to come up with joint kind of proposals that are supported by everybody, and it's even more difficult on the international level or global level. So therefore, I'm again a bit skeptical that we will see huge progress in this respect. Basel and others are good things, but it's only small steps. I think so. At the end of the day, it's all about, and this will never happen from my perspective, but it's all about, to some in a modern way, 21st century way, coming back to the system of embedded liberalism. We need capital controls. Banks and financial institutions need to know that they are not allowed to do some things. But it's difficult to. It will never happen. I'm pretty sure, because now the thing is out of the bottle, so you can't get it back. So there's no way.
But is it worth pursuing?
Oh, yeah, there are. But it's I think so. But if at all, societies learn and people learn by crises, and so maybe 2 more crises or so, then then they may learn about that. But it's difficult. You forget about those things. Who really thinks about 2007, 2008? It's like history. Even though we are still living with the repercussions of the situation, but actors, particularly given the fact that politicians, when they have a very kind of short time horizon, they want to be re-elected, and those kind of long-term projects, if they are accomplished, they are long retired or somewhere else in the industry or so, making their money there. I don't know.
Sure. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Okay.
That was University of British Columbia's Dr. Kurt Huebner discussing changes in the world order, from embedded liberalism to hyper globalism to economic nationalism. The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, presented the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World, with support from AEL&P, Kerr Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight and Associates, Sea Alaska, the Prospector Hotel, and Wastman and Associates.